Let me start by introducing the concept for this panel and our panelists as I welcome them up and they get settled up here. If you guys want to come sit behind your name tags. So the guiding question that I posed to this very esteemed panel was, what do you want the audience to keep in mind throughout the day today? So the panel, you'll see, have very, very different, but I think very complementary answers to that question. So our speakers are going to debunk some myths and some potentially faulty assumptions that they feel often underlie these kinds of work of the future discussions. They'll provide some facts about changes in the labor market, what's happening and what may not actually be happening. And they're going to encourage us all to keep workers' voices at the center of our discussions today, which I think is particularly crucial. So we'll first hear, I'll introduce all of our panelists now, but we'll first hear from Sarita Gupta. We've asked her to anchor this panel and to really set the tone for the morning. Sarita Gupta is the co-executive director of Jobs with Justice and the co-director of Caring Across Generations. She's a nationally recognized expert on economic, labor, and political issues affecting working people, particularly women and those employed in low-wage sectors. She's a key leader in the progressive labor, economic justice, women's, and caregiving movements, and has received numerous awards for her leadership. So then we'll turn it over to Abby Wozniak and Larry Katz for their responses to Sarita and some additions to what Sarita has shared. So Abigail Wozniak is a senior research economist and the very first director of the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis's Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute. She's a labor economist and an expert on how mobility and job tenure relate to labor market outcomes. She holds a PhD from Harvard, is a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and a research fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. Previously, she was a tenured associate professor of economics at the University of Notre Dame, and she served as a senior economist at the White House Council of Economic Advisors in 2014 and 2015. Larry Katz is the Elizabeth Allison Professor of Economics at Harvard, the editor of the Quarterly Journal of Economics, a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research, and importantly, he's the co-scientific director of JPAL North America, and he serves on the Work of the Future Initiative Review Board. Larry is an expert on issues in labor economics and the economics of social problems. He's received his PhD in economics from MIT, and he served as the chief economist of the US Department of Labor in 1993 and 1994. So I will start by welcoming Sarita to the podium.
Okay, great. All right. Good morning. Okay, we could do better. Good morning.
Good morning.
Need some energy in this room. I'm really thrilled to be here with all of you as JPAL North America launches this new research initiative and community of learning focused on the work of the future. I really want to thank you, Emma, and thank Larry, actually, for inviting me to speak this morning. And I'm really glad to be here to share some reflections on the changing nature of work and how that is shaping what is needed in this moment to pave pathways forward for working people to survive and thrive. So as Emma said, I'm the co-director of Jobs with Justice. For those of you who aren't familiar with us, along with our network of community labor coalitions, Jobs with Justice brings a range of unions of working people, community organizations, worker centers, faith groups, students, and individual activists who want to improve the lives, the communities, and workplaces of all people. We organize working people at the local, state, and national level on a broad range of issues to raise labor standards and to address issues impacting working people beyond their workplaces. We're centered around a mission to expand the ability of people coming together to have a say in the decisions that are impacting their lives and their futures. So in addition to improving access to jobs and the quality of jobs, which are key components of how we help people get out of poverty, we also want people to live full lives and engage in society. We ask ourselves, if we were truly to overcome poverty, Will we have developed the democracy and practices that ensure that people can live and work with dignity and joy? How about a little joy in people's lives? In doing the work to reduce poverty, understanding work and the experiences people face in their workplace is a core element of how we develop impactful and transformational solutions that address where people spend majority of their lives. I'm going to build upon an essay I wrote with two other colleagues, Stephen Lerner, who is a veteran organizer and campaigner, who is the architect of Justice for Janitors, and Joseph McCartan, the executive director of Georgetown University's Kalmanovitz Initiative for Labor and the Working Poor. Stephen, Joe, and I challenged the flawed assumptions inherent in conversations about the future of work. The dominant focus tends to center on how we grapple with fundamental technological advancements in the workplace, which some argue, and argue incorrectly, will lead to robots and automation, causing a rapid extinction of large swaths of the workforce. This is a conversation that preoccupies foundations, economists, government organizations, business consultants, and think tanks of all stripes. They produce research and host forum after forum about the future of work with analysis, predictions, and solutions. We assert in this article that we must center these conversations around the future of working people, whose future must be our most urgent concern. We argue that computerization and artificial intelligence do not represent the gravest threat to our future. It is the concentration of wealth and power by those who do not want a future where working people, Black, brown, and white, have power and agency, and where government and democracy also thrive. Therefore, what we really need to talk about is future of working people, whose future is inextricably linked to our ability to promote and preserve equality and democracy. This must be our most urgent concern. Unless we center our thinking around the intertwined and interdependent fates of working people and their struggles for economic, racial, and gender justice, we cannot plan for a humane and sustainable future. It's great to have David here because I recently listened to a talk that he gave where he explained that automation creates wealth by allowing us to do more work in less time. Fundamentally, the question that we have to grapple with is, will we use that wealth to create opportunity and economic mobility? David also shared that the challenge is not that we're running out of work, but in fact, the challenge is that many of those jobs are not good jobs that are being created, and many citizens cannot qualify for the good jobs that are being created. From my organization's perspective, some core features of a good job is one that provides family-sustaining wages and benefits, predictable and stable schedules, adequate hours of work, training and career pathways, respect and dignity, and voice and agency. David continues to explain in his talk that what we are experiencing is employment polarization, which I'm sure others will talk about on the panel, so I won't go in depth. But essentially, we're just seeing a growing population of people who are in low-wage jobs, whose primary responsibility right now is to see to the comfort and health of the affluent, right? So the concentration of wealth and power in this economy will determine how innovative technologies are deployed and in whose interest they operate. The future of work will be determined by who wields power and for what purposes. When I think about the future of workers, I think about my friend Kimberly. Kimberly works at Macy's in DC. She's a union member. Recently, Macy's adopted new technology to set schedules for workers, which meant that Kimberly was suddenly experiencing unpredictable schedules and inconsistent hours of work from week to week, which was impacting her budgets, her ability to attend her daughter's after-school events, parent-teacher meetings, etc. She's lucky to have a union, and together with her coworkers, they've been working to address these issues through collective action and negotiation. And as a result, they have in fact shaped and improved the scheduling system to benefit workers. Kimberly is also a mom, and when I met her, her daughter was still in DC public schools. She was very concerned about classroom sizes and conditions of her daughter's school. As a parent, she'd been trying to find ways to address needs of her local school and organize with other parents to make change. She's also a caregiver, an unpaid caregiver to her grandmother who is ill with cancer. For a number of years, Kimberly struggled with how best to care for her grandmother while working full-time. She has been a huge advocate for a broad range of care issues, like affordable and accessible care options and more supports for working family caregivers like herself. In fact, she's been one of the key spokespeople in the paid leave policy campaign in DC. So if all that you hear in the description of Kimberly is that she's a retail worker with bargaining rights, you are not seeing her as a whole person. And you're missing the fact that Kimberly desires to be able to have agency and govern over all aspects of her life. She wants to shape the DC public schools as a parent. She wants to have a say in shaping the supports that unpaid family caregivers like herself need. Working women and men want to have the ability to govern over all aspects of their lives. There are some who will say that all working people want and need are higher wages or a basic income. There is truth in that people need more money in their pockets. But it is also true that working people want to have agency in shaping their futures, in their workplaces, in their homes, and their communities. And we know that the most effective way that working people can achieve this ability is by banding together with coworkers, their neighbors, and other people to win a set of demands from entities that have power over their lives. This belief that people should be able to have agency in shaping their futures and should be able to do so through a collective means is precisely what is at risk right now in our culture, our politics as a nation, and in our democracy. We must remember that automation and the reorganization of employee-employer relations that former director of Wage and Hour Division of the Department of Labor, David Weil, calls fissuring, are taking place in a world economy that has been transformed by financialization and globalization in ways that have allowed a tiny number of individuals and entities to gain enormous, unprecedented power. They have used that power to shape an economy which continuously erodes the bargaining power of workers and squeezes profits from their communities, fueling radical inequality. Last year, Matthew Desmond wrote a piece titled, "Americans Want to Believe Jobs Are the Solution to Poverty. They're Not." He argued that the US unemployment is down and millions of jobs are going unfilled. But for most people, the question is not, can I land a job? Instead, the question is, what kinds of jobs are available to people without much education? By and large, the answer is jobs that do not pay enough to live on. In recent decades, the nation's tremendous economic growth has not led to broad social uplift. Over the last 40 years, the economy has expanded and corporate profits have risen, but real wages have remained flat for workers without a college education. And since 1973, American productivity has increased by 77%, while hourly pay has grown by only 12%. If the federal minimum wage tracked productivity, it would be more than $20 an hour, not today's poverty wage of $7.25. According to the Social Security Administration, the median yearly wage in the US is just $30,533 at this point. That means 50% of American workers make at least that much per year, but that also means that 50% of American workers make that much or less per year. So Desmond goes on to explain that the working poor are primarily adults, wiping down hotel showers and toilets, taking food orders and bussing tables, eviscerating chickens at meat processing plants, minding children at 24-hour daycare centers, picking berries, emptying trash cans, stacking grocery shelves at midnight, driving taxis and Ubers, answering customer service hotlines, smoothing hot asphalt on freeways, teaching community college students as adjunct professors, and bagging groceries and scooping ice cream. What this means is that many hardworking moms, dads, and young people aren't earning enough to sustain their families despite working in booming sectors of the society, like home care, restaurant and food service, childcare, and retail, to name a few. Too many working people today are facing hard choices. We see it in our work every day. Workers who are having to choose between paying for food, paying for housing, paying for childcare, or paying for medicine. Just think about that for a second. The people who serve food on our tables at restaurants and cafes cannot put food on their own tables. Or the people who care for our loved ones cannot afford care for themselves or their own families. In recent decades, we've witnessed the rise of bad quality jobs offering low pay, no benefits, and little certainty. When it comes to poverty, a willingness to work is not the problem, and work itself is no longer the solution. So American workers are being shut out of the profits that they're helping to generate. And the decline of unions is a big reason. In the last century, inequality in America decreased when unionization increased, but economic transformations and political attacks have crippled organized labor, emboldening corporate interests and disempowering the rank and file. Historically, the way working people have prospered is, in fact, through collective power and the ability to negotiate. So I believe that we must begin with revolutionizing the tool that has been bequeathed to us by more than a century and a half of worker struggles, organizing through collective action and negotiating with those who control the economy and our future through collective bargaining. The form of workplace-centered organizing and bargaining that evolved over the course of the 20th century, however, is not up to the challenge that workers and citizens face in this century in a changed economy. We need to forge new pathways, new ways that we organize and bargain that's appropriate to the world in which power is concentrating in the hands of fewer economic actors. Progress requires innovation and creativity beyond the frameworks of the past century to meet the modern day worker and in the economy she functions in. Many within the labor and worker advocacy movements are exploring new pathways to address key questions as work has changed. Who bargains? What do we bargain over? And who are we bargaining with? And even as we craft solutions and campaigns to raise labor standards, whether it's the Fight for 15 or one fair wage or predictable schedules, we must also think about the ways in which we're building power for the long term so that workers can shape the labor market. The Fight for 15 campaign has shifted the entire discussion about the minimum wage, beginning with fast food workers, and it has broadened since. They've opened up enduring conversations about what it's like to toil and raise a family on the minimum wage. Politicians and voters now embrace a much higher minimum wage as a result of the Fight for 15. But the goal of the Fight for 15 isn't just to increase the minimum wage to $15 an hour. The campaign's North Star is increasing bargaining opportunities for men and women who work in these industries. In fact, the slogan the campaign uses in many places is the Fight for 15 and a union. Focusing on workers means expanding our vision beyond workplaces. What happens to workers on the job is intimately connected to what happens in their communities, in their schools, and in their lived environments. It is also intimately connected to their gender, race, ethnic, and citizenship status. The same forces that are weakening worker bargaining power, reaping a growing share of productivity gains for investors, and making work more precarious, are also undermining public institutions like schools and mass transit, profiting from rising household debt, and shaping policies that are contributing to climate change and environmental injustice, especially for workers, immigrants, and communities of color. Improving workers' lives on the job cannot be separated from improving their lives off work. So we are seeing working people in motion today across many sectors, organizing for change. that are essentially expanding the range of participants, opening up the processes, and broadening the purposes of collective bargaining, and seeing that as critical. Many of you have probably been watching what's been happening with Educator Spring and teachers that are in motion right now. This has been a promising response to these new realities that has emerged from the public sector unions. It's known as bargaining for the common good. Campaigns that have been pioneered by teachers in Chicago, St. Paul, Seattle, state workers in Oregon, county workers in San Diego, and municipal workers in LA have consciously sought to redefine collective bargaining. And in these settings, unions joined with community allies to craft demands that advance the shared goals of workers and the community, demanded that those community members be seated at the bargaining table and use the bargaining process to identify, educate, and mobilize a broad constituency around an agenda that challenged the ways in which big money was dictating the public agenda. They've challenged the structures that have confined collective bargaining to issues that tend to divide unions from taxpayers, bringing militancy to bear by striking with the public's support when needed to advance their own causes. Until recently, much of bargaining for the common good has been primarily focused on workers already covered by collective bargaining agreements. That ceased to be the case earlier this year, or actually last year, I should say. The recent wave of teacher walkouts last spring were organizing bargaining and political campaigns all at once. These were teachers without collective bargaining rights in right-to-work states. They refused to return to work until all states' workers had received a pay increase equal to theirs in West Virginia. In Oklahoma, teachers protested the state's failure to fairly tax wealthy oil and gas interests. In Arizona, teachers demanded that the state enact no further tax cuts until the state's per pupil spending on education reached the national average. Since the vast majority of strikers were not union members, these walkouts were both massive organizing campaigns and democracy campaigns as well, since they posed such explicit political demands as raising taxes to fund public schools more adequately. Another sector where we see really interesting models underway, especially in employment growth sectors of the new economy, has been in the care sector. One of these is embodied in Caring Across Generations, a campaign that seeks to address the growing demand for elder care, how we fund that care, and how we ensure that the workers who provide it have training, pay, and benefits they need to do their best work, winning dignity for themselves in this process. While future of work prophets stroke fears about technology replacing workers, frontline healthcare jobs like those involved in elder care, many of which are done by women, people of color, and immigrants, are 5 of the top 8 fastest growing occupations. We know there are massive demographic shifts going on in our country, and we are certainly in the elder boom right now, with 4 million people turning retirement age every year. But we are also seeing the first wave of millennials having children at the rate of 4 million babies being born per year. These changing demographics mean a strained workforce that is underpaid, a heavy reliance on family caregivers who often find themselves making tough decisions about family and work, and a lack of home and community infrastructure needed to meet the desires of the 90% of Americans who want to age in their homes. An adult age workforce is dealing with new economic pressures, a lack of access to benefits, working in non-traditional environments, really struggling to afford and manage care, often at both ends of the generational spectrum if they're in the sandwich generation. We do not have a care infrastructure in place to meet these growing needs. And so as care is increasingly defining our entire economy, we have a tremendous opportunity here to transform this part of the economy in a way that creates quality care jobs and economic opportunity, particularly for historically underemployed, low-wage workers. By creating jobs in home care, we can meet a clear social need for care for our nation's aging and support pathways to training and citizenship for immigrant workers, many of whom are already doing the care work. So the campaign seeks to transform the way we care through 3 objectives. One is by creating affordable and accessible care options for families and individuals, and by creating much needed supports for working family caregivers. Actually, family caregivers both within the labor force and outside of the labor force. And so this slide shows a few of the state campaigns that have been in motion. In Hawaii, we won the first financial benefit for working family caregivers, really helping mostly women be able to stay in the labor force and provide the care that they need. And in Washington State, we're on the cusp of passing a very similar type of policy. In Maine, we attempted to do something very creative, which was to take the issue of home care to voters directly and create within that framework a tripartite system by which workers, people who utilize the benefit of home care, a universal home care, which is what we were pushing for, and industry could come together to design the program and to ensure and set labor standards in that sector. The thing to understand is a lot of home care work is domestic work, which is unique in that work relationships tend to be informal and employers tend to be individual families. Traditional collective bargaining is challenging for two related reasons. First, on the employee side, there's no collective, with domestic workers are usually the sole employee in a home. And second, with respect to the employer, there's no firm. So we are trying to innovate and find new ways to ensure that we're raising labor standards and creating pathways for domestic workers, home care workers to be able to, in fact, have the kind of training career ladders that they need, as well as better job quality. We're also exploring portable benefits. The National Domestic Workers Alliance just launched a whole new portable benefits program called ALIA. And this is the first attempt at finding ways to pool resources from employers, from families, individuals, that could then be utilized as a benefit for care workers. So these are all very exciting trends, and there's many others. I mean, certainly, there's a whole set of work being done among workers who are contesting monopoly power of their employers, workers at Amazon, for example, who are really trying to figure out how do you organize and how do you change labor standards within massive vertical monopolies like Amazon. Through all these approaches, what we're learning a lot about is how policy solutions can improve jobs, but also how they can create pathways for organizing and collective forms that allow people to shape labor markets. All these approaches are mindful of centering race and gender in ways that offer opportunities to confront and change structural racism and sexism. There are many structures and systems that affect people's lives: housing, transportation, health access, education, and jobs, to name a few. These systems are all interconnected. These are also systems that can perpetuate race and gender inequities. We know that the fans does not seem to want to advance. Okay, here we go. Sorry. We know that this is a chart that just shows the median family incomes by race. In 1947, we begin to see a rise in incomes, but note the inequities across race that continue to this day. We know that national unemployment rates for Blacks and Latinos are higher, respectively, compared with rates for whites. All of which means that people of color are lagging well behind white communities on just about every measure of well-being, including health, home ownership, wealth, and longevity. On average, American women earn 78% of what men earn. The imbalance of power reinforces systems and structures that affect decision-making and resource allocations in communities. These types of inequities. So in all of these approaches, advocates are centering race and gender, trying to advance equity, which requires attention to power. Because an imbalance of power reinforces the systems and structures that affect decision-making and resource allocations, which can reinforce inequities in opportunities. They are confronting structural racism and sexism as they expand the scale and scope through which ordinary people are able to organize and collectively negotiate against shared entities and win. The goal is not simply to win short-term compromises for a small number of people. The wins that we're striving for are ways that we can alter our shared understanding of what is possible, providing the political space for the majority to essentially govern in ways that match our values of putting people and our environment over the profits of a tiny few. I'm going to draw us back to caring across generations for a moment, because what I mean by practitioners really trying to center race and gender, caring across generations is an example of an intersectional campaign. It started with home care workers, but by listening to home care workers, some of the most vulnerable workers in the nation, who are making poverty wages, on average about $9 an hour, $13,000 a year, 30% of them rely on public assistance programs for food security. They lack benefits like healthcare, and they can't meet their own care needs. When we talked to them, we realized that care is far more complex than consumers on one side and a paid workforce on the other. Care is a universal issue, touching everybody in different ways. So home care workers are not only paid workforce, many of them are working family caregivers themselves. Some are in the sandwich generation, caring for elders and children. And many are also in need of care themselves in the future. So instead of developing an approach to win job improvements for home care workers, we're working to transform the system of care in this country that benefits all of us. So as I conclude, I just want to say that there's tremendous opportunity before us, and that's what's exciting about this initiative in this moment we're in. We know that democracy and economic growth and development have had a strong correlative and interactive relationship throughout history, and there may be lots of debates about how and where and et cetera. But I'm going to hearken back to the beginning of this talk when I shared that I and others in my organization ask ourselves, if we were to overcome poverty, will we have developed the democracy and governing practices that ensure that people can live and work with dignity and joy? The future of work will be determined by who wields power and for what purposes. Many of the approaches that I talked about today are doing just that, finding ways for people to have a collective say in decisions about their lives while also improving labor standards and the quality of jobs. We are in a moment of great transformation. Work is changing, as we know. This creates opportunities for us to develop whole new legal, policy, organizing, and cultural frameworks that address the lived experiences of working people, to imagine what a new social contract can be. We have an opportunity to reset how we think about jobs, poverty, and progress. And I think partnerships are really key. As a practitioner, being able to partner with researchers here who can help us evaluate our innovations and our tools is a really key part of how we ensure that we, in fact, meet our goal of reducing poverty and improving the lives of people in the future. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Sarita. I have a number of thoughts to follow on and connect with yours, but let me start just for a minute by introducing myself again and saying a little bit about what I am doing at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve and why I'm here. So I'm Abby Wozniak, and as Emma mentioned, I'm the inaugural director of the Opportunity and Inclusive Growth Institute, which is housed at the Minneapolis Federal Reserve. It's an initiative, though, that hopes to reach the entire Federal Reserve System. And our mission is to conduct and promote research into our mission areas of opportunity and inclusive growth. But the reason we're doing that is really in support of the Federal Reserve's full employment mandate, to pursue full employment through their policies. And I think as anyone who's been studying labor economics recently or for many decades, as some of us have, we understand that this question of what is full employment is not just a question about a number anymore and an unemployment rate. This is a question about what does it mean to have full employment when we've learned that home environments and early education and school environments have dramatic impacts on individuals' long-run outcomes. If we vary those environments and we do provide some for some folks and don't provide them for others, have we really achieved maximum employment? We could have made different choices. And also, what does this maximum employment mean when folks, like Sarita, I think really aptly said, are not necessarily working with dignity and joy? Are we really fully working to our full capacity? So my job at the Institute is to try to be connected and aware of everything that we're learning that brings to bear on those really, really important questions. So I'm so excited to be connecting with you all here today. So when I first talked with Sarita about her remarks, I made a note to myself that one of her main takeaways was to, as I would put it, question the assumption that the robot apocalypse is inevitable. That's how I summarized it for myself in my head. And the reason that's so important is because it highlights, as I think the nice naming choice in Work of the Future makes, it highlights that the work of the future will instead be the result of choices we make, as opposed to forces that are inexorably acting upon us. That's not to deny that forces exist. There are cost-benefit trade-offs. People follow incentives. As an economist, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. But choices are really critical in constructing the environment that we're going to operate in going forward. The real big challenge is that we must make those choices collectively. Now, whether we do that in a decentralized way and we let the market operate and give us our kind of the map our choices out that way, or we take some more kind of direct and concerted action, again, that's really a question that's going to face us all going forward. But that collective choice is what's really, really challenging about this. And what I think compounds the challenge is that we have such big questions before us about where to go. But as economists, we're actually still working to understand where we are right now. And so what I want to say a little bit about is some work that I've been doing and work that I've seen by others that is really telling us a bit more about where we are now. And I think that's going to be a really critical input into the decisions we make about how to steer the forces that we're facing going forward. So, and a thread coming out of some of my own work, like I mentioned, and work that's been done by others, and I'm going to really very briefly summarize it here, is that over the last several decades, I think counter to a lot of the stories and narratives we've been hearing, US jobs have actually demonstrated remarkable stability, and in some dimensions, we might even think that work today and employment situations today are more stable than they were in the past. And what I mean by the word stable is not changing. So again, I think as we construct and make these choices, the words that we use are really important. And this is a set of questions around which words can be difficult. I don't mean to connote anything about stability that is either positive or negative. I mean to kind of simply summarize the fact that what we're finding is that there are many ways in which a work situation for an individual in the US labor force today is likely to be less different from year to year and over that person's life cycle than something that might have been experienced by a cohort in the past. So what is the evidence base for making that kind of statement? So there's a body of work, and I've contributed to some of it. Others in this room have contributed to it, and others elsewhere. There's a body of work finding that labor market transitions of all kinds have really become less common for US workers since about 1980. And when we say labor market transitions, it's a big clunky set of 3 words, but that's meant to encompass really almost any kind of change that you would make in a significant way in the course of your employment career in the labor market. This includes movement from employer to employer, job to job changes, moves in and out of the labor force. So once you're in, you're more likely to stay in, and once you're out, it takes longer to get back in. This includes occupation changes. That's one that's been the subject of some measurement conversations, but I think is coming out in the same direction as all of the other transitions that we're talking about, and also includes my personal favorite, geographic moves. So we find that these shifts and these changes are actually slowing down to some extent for workers. Now this runs, I think, fairly counter to what we hear when we talk about work in the US. And so I'm going to talk in the next slide a bit about just some follow-on work I've done to try to dig into that and understand how is it possible that there's a perception that work is less stable, and yet a lot of the data points to work being more stable, again, in this sense of not changing as much from year to year for an individual. Another characteristic of this research is that for the most part, it finds that these changes are very broad-based. So that means that this applies to folks throughout the education spectrum, throughout the age spectrum, throughout the earning spectrum. So we can't necessarily point to a single sector of the labor market that's experiencing this kind of rise in stability. There's a possible acceleration in this after the mid-1990s. That might give us some clues as to why this is happening, but I would definitely extend the trends back to, like I said, at least around 1980. And I think even perhaps most surprisingly, this is based on really recent work by Fatih Gubanin and Nick Bloom and a team of co-authors. Work with administrative data sets is showing that even earnings for workers are becoming more stable over time. Again, that runs counter, I think, to some of the conversations that we hear. It even runs counter to some of the early evidence that we had on this question. But it all points in this direction of a rising kind of stability in US work situations. Again, like I've highlighted, it's not yet clear whether stability, as I've defined it here, is good or bad for workers. That's really part of the ongoing work of figuring out where are we now, what does this mean? And I do want to highlight that an exception that I think has received a lot of attention and tends to show up as well in the data is that very long-term employment has declined for US men, but we're actually finding in our own research that this is limited to employer-specific relationships, and that men who separate after a long time with an employer go on to be re-employed as well in the labor market. So just because I wanted to give you a picture to show you how things unfold over time, just one graph here shows you that workers right now are less likely to be new on their jobs. This is just one example of the manifestation of this rising stability. This shows you that since 1996, the share of workers in their prime years who have been on the job less than a year is actually falling. And all the colored lines mean is that if we try to control for a bunch of things that have changed in the economy over this period as well, doesn't get us very far in explaining why that has become less common over time. And again, as I said, there's a kind of rising body of literature that if I had lots of time would be really fun to summarize that points in this direction of just rising stability in the US workforce over time. So what kind of challenges does this pose for evaluating the future of work? And I actually want to highlight two of these that I think link pretty well to topics that Sarita has brought up, and actually that also came up in Marianne's excellent introduction. So when we think about this kind of rising stability, we again are faced with this question of, is this good or bad? And that really points to this bigger question of how are we going to measure overall welfare? If we want to understand if a change is good or bad for workers or families or our community, we need to understand, have a much broader picture of the overall welfare impacts of any given change than I would argue to date we really have had typically as economists. It's been easy to focus on wages or earnings. We measure those reasonably well. We also measure them quickly and at high frequency, and that's great. But as Sarita mentioned, a focus on that is an extremely limited slice of what work and a job provide for individuals. And going forward, I think the questions of the other things that work and jobs provide are just going to be bigger and more important. So to really provide high quality evaluation of programs and interventions, we need to have a much broader picture of evaluation of welfare than we've had in the past. And we need to understand the nature of a worker's experience in detail. A kind of second challenge that I want to highlight is the importance of, once we have this research, figuring out how we can interact constructively with public narratives. And I was hoping that I would have brilliant ideas on how to do that, to fill in here. That's a real challenge. I think it's incredibly hard. I have kind of two thoughts on that I think I can leave you with, but I hope that will actually be part of our conversations and to hear from presenters about how they've engaged with the public conversation. The first point to think about is it might perhaps be better for all of us, in a welfare community sense, if we got away from the idea of science as news. Because news tends to have this upending quality that seems to then undermine credibility in science. And just a kind of final point on that, an example I was thinking of is actually looking out here over the river. We don't build bridges the way we used to build bridges, right? We don't build them with bricks out of arches anymore. It's tremendously expensive and not nearly as stable as a suspension, a beautiful kind of suspension system that we have. But we're not hearing news stories that say, previous bridge builders were all wrong. This does not work. But often that's the way our research is presented, right? Reading to kids is important. Oh, research says reading to kids, actually that was picking up something different. Never mind about reading to kids. And we hear this in the reporting and coverage of science, and I think it's reflected in the way that sometimes we communicate our own findings. But again, just trying to get away from science as news, something that changes from day to day and gets upended, to something that we kind of live with and understand as a broader community that evolves. If we can be thinking about how to contribute to that, I think that will go a way towards handling this very pressing challenge of communication. Thank you.
So I'm delighted to be able to follow on the not traditional starting of a Future of Work event that Sarita provided us, and thinking about the centrality of workers and agency and, as she said, dignity and joy of work, as well as the bottom line dollars and cents figures, and Abby's very nice presentation of the important role that research can bring not only to the Federal Reserve System, but more broadly science, to think about that sometimes narratives and examples don't always stand up to the systematic facts. And I want to give a little bit of an overview of some of the trends that I think connect to what Sarita and Abby said, and then talk a little bit about some examples of what we hope this initiative can do in connecting to research and randomized control trials, to try to think about ways to bring into the fact that the future of work is not currently exactly going to be determined just by where robots go or AI, but there are going to be a lot of decisions on the policy front and by individual workers, firms, and families. So the way I look at, one of my favorite facts to sort of put in context the concerns that Sarita raised, and that are very much what the Federal Reserve Board is thinking about and thinking about full employment, is a particular notion of the American dream that my colleagues Raj Chetty and Nathan Hendren have been looking at, which is, historically, we have typically thought that each generation of Americans has better opportunities than the previous group. It's your immigrant parents or long time being here. And in the mid-20th century, that is what you saw in the data. Literally, this is the fraction of young people in their 30s who have higher real income earned in the labor market than their parents. And well over 90% of all Americans satisfied that for people born in the mid-20th century. Today, with growing inequality and a bit of slowdown of growth, but really from the growing inequality and divergence in the labor market, that's more of like a coin flip. In fact, in most recent data, in parts of the US, in the Midwest, maybe 45%. So the typical American had 3 times the median income of their parents if they were born in the early 1950s, and they have, sort of 1.1 times today. So with a fair amount of, volatility in exactly where you end up relative to your parents, we're now seeing a very, the notion that seemed to actually be close to true, that almost everyone can do better than their parents, find a job in a situation that would lead them there, is no longer the case. So so this is driven by the fact that median wages have basically stagnated, over the last 4 decades, and that there's a substantially growing gap between pay and productivity. It's what, Claudia Gold and I have called in our book, Race Between Education and Technology, a world of growing together in the mid-20th century, where throughout the distribution, everyone was gaining almost 3% a year with fast productivity growth, broadly shared prosperity, wide access to growing education. Clearly lots of gaps still there by gender, by race, ethnicity, but a sense of progress, to the recent period where in the bottom parts of the distribution, there's been no real earnings growth for decades, and only the top part is continuing. And this is what household data is. Obviously, if we went to the top 1% who aren't represented here, that red bar would be well off the spectrum. And so we had a period where technology was growing very rapidly, yet it didn't mean, growing immiseration in the mid-20th century. It meant lots of opportunities for better jobs for a wide range of individuals. And this has been associated with this growing gap that Sarita mentioned. In that period of, widespread prosperity, productivity and hourly wages pretty much grew lockstep, as they had through most of the 20th century. Economists wrote down models of growth that said labor share always stays the same. Well, that is not true today. There are 2 big reasons why there is a huge growing gap between productivity and hourly compensation. The biggest is that among workers, inequality has been growing dramatically, an education divide, and within all education groups, growing dispersion between these polarized jobs that David Otter and others pointed out, where top-end jobs are doing very well, but more people are ending up as in markets of home health aides, retail jobs where wages have been stagnant, except maybe a little bit over the last couple of years, where movements like the Fight for 15 in a tight labor market, we're seeing some wage growth, but not much to offset those long-run trends. And the second is the decline in labor share. Most of that is the growing inequality, but there's also been a clear shift going on. So we have a growing education divide, this labor market polarization, rising importance of sort of interactive and social skills. When you look at jobs, they're the things, that's what the value is in in-person services, as well as the value in high-end professional and managerial jobs. It's not, just technical skills, it's the interaction of the two. On top of that, while individual jobs are becoming more stable, with an employer, who works for who now becomes incredibly important. If you're going to end up with a type of employer or an agency for a long period of time, whether you're in one with pathways for wages to grow and with a high wage premium and good benefits or not, becomes more and more important. And there's a growing fissuring or segregation of the labor market, as David Weil, the wage and hour administrator, another one of our Harvard PhDs in labor economics, along with Abby, has shown, so that increasingly we're in a world in that period of growing prosperity that was very balanced, where the janitor, the clerical worker, the middle manager, the person working in the cafeteria, as well as the engineers and top, finance people, all worked for one company with one system of benefits. There's still a stability. The janitor may be working for a janitorial firm and have a stable job, but they're no longer earning the premium they would have gotten as the auto worker or the bank. And so while there's a growing correlation between your sort of elite family status and the premium your employer pays. So while jobs become more stable, they're also becoming more unequal. And the notion that you could enter the market, bop around through a few jobs, as was the case in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. So there's a lot of early instability, but eventually end up in a high wage job. That's the part that's not changing. It isn't that people have totally unstable jobs, as Abby said, but there's a growing persistent divergence in who works for whom and what sort of premium they get. And on top of that, this goes hand in hand with the growing large dominant firms sector by sector, which David Otter, John von Reenen, Christina Patterson, and David Dorn have called superstar firms, dominating their markets, but only employing directly more elite groups of workers. So that's fit in with labor share declining. And finally, these things have all played the role in the stagnating median wages. And even, at the bottom, the fights that have been going on to raise wages have kept things in check, but the middle has really been collapsing so that the high end is just taking off from everyone, and there is more stability in the bottom half of the distribution, but we still have a trend towards inequality. And so what I wanted to just finish up with are a couple examples building on Sarita. One area that we know is going to continue to be important because demographics are pretty much preordained for the future. We have an aging society. We have a huge cohort of children is care work. And as Sarita pointed out, this is the future of sort of work. And what we're going to mean is going to you probably have a lot more to do with what ends up happening in care jobs, retail jobs, customer service jobs over the long run than exactly what trade policies we do for protecting, a small number of manufacturing jobs ends up doing. And so these are very hard work, very important work that we all benefit from, whether it's for our elderly relatives or our children, and very poorly remunerated. Currently. Is there a pathway to use research to work on some of these things, to actually test some of the models Sarita talked about? Could you actually work to upgrade the training? We know there's going to be millions of jobs needed in this area. Expand the scope of practice of a home health aide who often may not be allowed to give an injection or even put eye drops in someone's eyes, something that, is there a way, thinking about it, given the huge, healthcare costs, that you could work with an organization of worker representatives, with the workers themselves, with a state Medicaid, to try to create a training and professional development platform to upgrade the productivity of this work, to justify higher pay? And would you actually then be able to generate further savings in the system? For example, would you help the family caregiver who now could trust someone else to move out and be more productive in the labor market and advance her career, because this is largely women? Could you have savings in the acute care part of the healthcare system if a home health aide is actually improving it? So thinking about a randomized control trial where you could actually randomize among workers if you were starting up a program to see, do you benefit from getting access to this training, and potentially among patients to see, are there savings and collateral benefits, is the type of thing you can imagine this initiative doing. And just to conclude, we actually have some examples of doing this in other sectors. So a series of randomized control trials to show the sort of potential here, known as sectoral employment training programs. We have 9 recent randomized control trials from sectors ranging from IT, help desk sort of people, Periscolas, an organization in the Bronx, to health aides, the Jewish Vocational Services here in Boston, to an amazing set of jobs that Year Up. I know we have some people, I believe, here in Boston, other places, have been doing with youth internships of moving people into jobs they never would have had, that combine, some soft skills training, work with a group consortium of employers to build a curriculum of work to really try to move people into higher skill jobs and create pathways for careers. And the bottom line we're seeing is, unlike traditional training programs where there's an agency of the workers sort of being involved in the firms, we're seeing repeatedly 20, 30, 40, even 50 to 70% earnings impacts that persist 5 or 6 years out, raising a whole bunch of questions. Are there ways we could expand programs like this? Could we reduce some of the screening that goes ahead and still produce these sort of benefits for a wider range of workers? Are there other sectors like care where we haven't thought of these things where we can do it? But I'm saying there is potential to use research and figure out a model, test it. We have new startups that have done this in Tulsa and in Cleveland versus long-lasting ones like Perscalas and Jewish Vocational Services. So I think the research policy interface potentially has a lot, can create a future of work where there are broader opportunities if we take seriously working with partners and trying to test better models.
Excellent. So I think one of the major themes I heard you guys bring up, as Abby said so nicely, is that words are important, and the way that we talk about this sort of defines the scope of the conversation. We're thinking about this in a few different ways at JPAL. For one thing, I remember David Otter wanting to name the initiative Work of the Future, because future of work kind of sounds like it has a question mark on the end and feels a little bit more in line with that kind of like job apocalypse instability scenario. And so by calling it Work of the Future, we're saying that there's going to be work in the future, and it's really just a question of what are the choices we're making with regards to power and all these other things that you all have brought up. One other area JPAL's been thinking about a lot is using phrases interchangeably, things like disadvantaged or low wage or low skill or low education. And so one thing that we're going to ask everybody to be very thoughtful about today is just to be precise with your language rather than using, for example, low skill as a proxy for low wage. And I'm wondering for the panelists, are there other ways that we tend to talk about this Work of the Future subject that you think we need to be more careful about or that we should be re-examining?
I mean, I think that there the way I would put it is that the labor market is a very complicated and changing place, and that, I think we can make progress. It's going to be a combination of detailed descriptive analysis of the trends, the type of work Gail does, listening very carefully to people, potential partners, both the workers themselves, employers, policymakers, and then trying to think about are there, with all of these big questions, whether it's ways of improving voice, what are the can one convince have a test of ways that sort of benefits their lives may also benefit productivity in the workplace. So I think trying to think of clever ways of studying potentially innovations in the way work is organized, in training, in some incentives or benefits. We're going to hear about some workplace wellness programs today. I think there's a lot of potential. And in many cases, like we'll see in Damon Jones' work on wellness programs, often just looking at the descriptive stuff can be helpful, but can be misleading. And I'm led by this in some of this work on training programs, where typically the way you think of it is if you're a training provider, you look at the absolute outcomes of the people you train. So if you see people are getting jobs at $30,000 a year versus $25,000, you may think you're doing a great job. But if you don't actually have a comparison group, if you picked people who would have done that without your program, you could be fooling yourselves. And what we have seen, for example, we did a big national evaluation of Youth Build, is that different youth programs had very different sort of screens, and the ones that they thought they were doing great actually picked people who had very similar opportunities, whereas with the randomized control trial, you actually learned that digging a little deeper for people you wouldn't have thought would benefit from your program actually had bigger, marginal value added substantially, because of the types of individuals who actually gained a lot. And so I think that the scientific approach is not only about learning these policies, but I think one of the outcomes is actually helping programs themselves figure out better ways to deliver their services.
think, and one thing I'd add on is I think something that we are just starting to talk about is the concept of dignity. And other groups in our kind of wider social sphere have talked about that for a long time. But I think as social scientists, it's something that we haven't talked a lot about. So I think talking about it is good, but I think a caution that I have is that we think of it kind of separately or as just another thing we should talk about, as opposed to really just starting to have the hard conversation of how dignity connects with pay and earnings and power. Get myself into trouble a little bit here, but I think sometimes the way we treat members of the armed services is to elevate dignity. And then I sometimes wonder, why don't we also pay more or provide? Why can't we improve the benefits that are being offered? So I think that illustrates that there's a willingness to have a conversation about dignity, but then sometimes in this country we separate it off from other components. And so I think just immediately pulling that into the conversation and recognizing that those two things are linked will be an important but hard part of this.
Yes, you echoed exactly what I was going to say. So ditto that. And I just want to remind us, I feel like in a lot of these conversations, we don't talk enough about racial disparities and we don't talk enough about gender disparities. And I think it's really important to not to treat these disparities as outliers, but really to examine them as ways to really help us understand trends and then help us understand the solutions that we need. So I just want to add that note as we think about the kind of data, the approaches we take. It really matters to look at that through those frames and those lenses as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. Thank you all.
I think David.
You want to add on, Larry?
I think David was raising his.
Oh, yeah. Yes, we're opening it up for questions now. So Kelsey, actually, this is great. David, you can model this for us. Kelsey is going to hand you the microphone. Please say your name and your institution, and then ask, is it a comment or does it end in a question mark? It can be a comment.
Can someone else go?
We'll start with a comment from David, and then we'll move to questions.
David
from
Otter,
people.
MIT, and the JPAL Work of the Future initiative, which I'm co-PIing with Matt Notovico. The comment I was going to make, but also can be turned into a question by adding a question mark at the end, is that in addition to talking about the dignity and the pay, something that I think connects to this and sort of is a subtext of your remarks that I want to highlight is part of it also is about raising the productivity of workers in a way that improves their pay and the quality of the work they do. So Larry gave the example of home healthcare workers who are sort of prevented from doing many of the things they'd be capable of doing. They can't give a shot, they can't administer a pill, and so of course their wages are going to be lower than if they were allowed to do these other really important things. And you think about it, you're sending someone out to someone's house. That's incredibly expensive and time intensive, and then you're preventing them from doing all the things they can do there. And more broadly, especially as we move into an era where we're going to face labor shortages, fewer young people, actually fewer young people with who actually don't have advanced degrees, we should be thinking hard about how we can use them better. That will benefit benefit employers and it'll benefit those workers. Giving people opportunities to use a greater set of capabilities and skills will benefit not just output, but the quality and the esteem and the pay. So I guess the question is, where are other opportunities to look at sectors where we have a lot of employment and we don't do much to augment people's capabilities? So I think about all the people who are cleaning hotels, all the people who are serving food, and how do we change working conditions in a way that uses their labor better?
Thanks. Does anybody have any initial answers that they would like to offer?
This is a hard one, but I'll start with an example that had gotten me thinking about this, and this is really a book plug. If you want some fun reading, I recently read a memoir called The Long Haul, which is about a long haul interstate mover. And it's a tremendous, really, memoir that talks so much about the dignity of work. And I was, as the labor economist, fascinated by it. I was hoping to learn about why people do or don't move, but it wasn't about that. It was really about work and his expertise. And he explains all of the skill that goes into doing this in a way that gets all your stuff there and doesn't break it. And it's a tremendous amount of skill. So it really, I don't think I have a good answer to your question, but it got me thinking about all the ways in which we don't measure or even describe expertise as being part of a job, right? So I wouldn't have described moving work as having a chain of expertise, but he can really describe the industry from the inside and explain how he worked from a level with very little expertise and skill up to a level where he has a very high level of skill. So I think maybe trying to get better pictures of just, if you have been in an industry like the restaurant industry for 20 years, you have a great deal of experience, expertise, and really building those ladders into our perceptions of all work, as opposed to, well, these are jobs that never provide any expertise. What you're doing on day one is the same as what you're doing 10 years from there, versus thinking that those two things are distinct. Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And just, I think that some of the sectors you named, actually, David, are the ones that I would have named, like hotel, food service, retail, even transit. There's a lot to look at and understand on that front. And I really appreciate you raising the labor shortage. I'm actually on a task force in Maryland looking at the workforce shortage for direct care workers right now. And it's really complicated because it's both, we have to improve the jobs, the quality of the jobs, but then in rural settings, for example, or even some urban settings, it's like transportation, the ability for workers to get from one client to the next client are huge barriers in terms of productivity and the way in which we retain people in these jobs as well, because it's both getting people into those fields, into those sectors, but then keeping them in those sectors. So there's a lot of complexity there, and still a tremendous amount of research needed to really help us think through the career ladders or the pathways that we need.
No, I agree. And as your work, David, and others have shown, we know that no matter how rapidly we think AI and robotics to transform, there's still a huge part of work where, it's very difficult to explain what it is, and that someone with experience, think about moving, something into different parts of your apartment, everyone is idiosyncratic, every move, you might, there's a technology that could lift a piano up to the next floor, but actually figuring out how to place it in the right way of doing it, there's still a lot of human knowledge and experience that we need to value, whether it's a care worker. In principle, the technologies can deal with, some of these issues. Think about someone working in a hospital, a nurse, and how much time they're doing running and entering stuff. So computer vision, monitoring, other things could take away a lot of the sort of hassles of those jobs, but leave them to more dealing with the, empathetic and psychological aspects of the patients and dealing with, the softer sort of information that you can't just read off a monitor. So I think the big questions going forward is, how do you think about, in a human-centered way, raising the dignity, taking to advantage the tacit knowledge that individuals have in jobs and ways to create careers where, the technology is not displacing workers, but it's really allowing what is most distinctly human to be the most valued part of the job.
Okay. I saw this hand in the back first.
Good morning. Katie Hamilton with the Center for Work, Education, and Employment based in Denver, Colorado. So when we think about this notion of agency and dignity and joy within the context of the changing nature of work and the labor market, who are the corporate and business leaders that are really leaning in and thinking about, really partnering with their workforce? I'm interested in, hearing about within the context of vertical structures and the behemoth corporations are their leaders.
Can we also actually take one more question from over here, Kelsey, really quickly, because we have like 3 minutes, and then they can address pieces of the questions as they see fit.
Thank you very much. I'm Mary Alice McCarthy from the Center on Education and Skills at New America. And I have a question about how to deal with sort of occupational segregation by sex. We did a recent study of the Adult Training and Education Survey that looks at the distribution of non-degree credentials across the US population. And we looked at that distribution for workers below the bachelor's degree. And what we found was that, for one thing, that distribution of credentials was very segregated by occupational sector, and that the non-degree credentials, the certifications, licenses, certificates that women earned, or people in female-dominated occupations, were worth a lot less than the ones that men earn or the people in male-dominated occupations. But the real kicker was that on top of that, we found that men, or people working in men specifically, were more likely to have accessed employer-funded training. So the women's credentials were worth less, and they were paying more for them. So when we put out this report, a lot of the feedback we got was, well, I know we really have to have women to stop choosing those jobs in healthcare and education. And so my question for you is, first of all, how are you thinking about credentialing, and how do we address those kinds of questions of like, well, women shouldn't choose those jobs?
Okay. You guys like to take one of those two?
And do employers? Do you have employers? I talk about men in nursing.
You why don't you start on?
Okay. So I have just a couple of thoughts in response to the occupational choices. So I have some work looking at men going into RN work because actually maybe we want women to stop choosing those jobs, but we spend some time trying to think about how do we get men to choose those jobs, because we think of the healthcare sector as very growing. And that work focused specifically on RNs because it is a well-remunerated part of that market. So, I think something that really jumped out from that work was, and I don't know that the RN field is unique, but this deserves more investigation. What jumped out from that is how far into individuals' kind of life cycles they spend changing occupations. So we found that people continue to move into the RN field up to about age 35. And so many of our training pathways either are designed to end at age 22 or age 18, or they're designed as kind of very quick hit, shorter credentials. And so thinking about how to create a longer pathway was definitely, I think, a lesson that came out of that. And I think that the RN field offers some really nice examples of how to do that. They have degrees that build upon one another. You can start, and there's a great deal of employer support. And I guess I would suspect that women are as responsive to that as men. But I think then if women aren't taking up those opportunities where they exist, we would maybe want to ask, I think, also questions about culture and our fields that are kind of highly compensated and have those pathways but aren't traditionally female. What kind of work have they been doing to be more inclusive for different types of students?
Did you guys have something you wanted to share on the first question as well?
Sure. So, I think there's, a couple issues on the employers getting involved. So, for example, we have in these sectoral employment training programs, there are a lot of employers who get involved in them and have working within, I think, one, the tighter the labor market, clearly, so the Fed, the more interest employers have in wanting to, work on retention and creating these sort of opportunities, since it's not so easy to just hire people cheaply and not so worry about, sort of churn. The second is, this is where I think, in some cases, there may be things that are very, very, very employer specific and they have an economic incentive to do it, but they're clearly the extent to which skills and talents are broader than a single employer, there is an issue. They're always concerned. This is the growth of non-competes and non-poach of sort of, you're going to invest a lot in the worker and then you're going to lose them because of the outside market. And that's sort of where something like sectoral employment training programs potentially play a role, or a community college or others, where in some sense, you share the cost of a bunch of employers. There are types of positions with some possibility moving forward, but if you go out unilaterally and do it, then all the other employers in your sector can sort of raid those workers, and you've sort of paid for their training. Is there a sort of joint funding of the types of skills that are growing that offer sort of employment today, but then create longer term opportunities once you get within? So I think thinking of sort of sectoral models may be a way of getting employers more engaged in this. There are clearly some cases of very large employers where they can do it on their own, but I think for many medium-sized ones, that may be more the way of trying to work with an intermediary who is trusting, whether it's a community college, other nonprofit organization, with employers and workers to create a curricula and certification. And we have, working with the hospitals in Chicago, one of the new projects that JPAL North America is funding, Marianne Bertrand, is trying for women in the healthcare sector to provide pathways for existing workers to move into jobs with higher certification and to sort of create those sort of ladders, working with a consortium of hospitals there. So that's an example, I think.
Great. So that's all the time we have. We're going to take a break for a few minutes and come back at 11 for the next panel. But if you have questions, feel free to come up and chat with our panel. Thanks, everyone.